And the floor is yours. You are a very well-known figure, to recap, studying on Silk Road and also geopolitics, nationalism, diplomacy. And you are going to talk about probably the differences between cultural diplomacy and heritage diplomacy.
Yeah.
And hopefully. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca, and thank you again for the invitation. You suggested, I'm just trying to share screen, and you suggested I should talk for around 20 minutes or so I will try and do that. Mm-hmm. And please either interrupt or tell me to stop if that's better for you. So I'm happy to do that.
Thank you so much.
Can you see my screen? You should be able to.
Yeah, perfectly.
Yeah. Okay. So this is a slide from the National Museum in Beijing, and as you can see, what's quite interesting there is the ways in which this was a art installation that was on display. It may still be there, but it was certainly last year, and the ways in which it told the story of kind of Chinese development. And you see there the Great Wall that's now being trumped by the Silk Road story up in the top, and Dunhuang and the camels crossing the Silk Road. So the ways in which this has entered Chinese imagination. And I'll talk a bit about that in the next 20 minutes. So I'll let you read that. Basically, that's from a book this year that says that there's very little connection between cultural theory and international relations. And this is from a book on I think it's the role of culture in world order, but you can find the title from the names of the authors. So I guess my work is trying to do that, trying to bridge that gap between cultural theory and cultural. So I'm a cultural sociologist, but try to look across disciplines and cross-disciplinary boundaries. And the themes I've been working on for the last, I guess, 15 years, really. I did a PhD and then a book on Cambodia and post-conflict Cambodia and the role of history and archaeological sites, including Angkor, in the role of post-conflict reconstruction. And this was a place where 20 or so countries became involved. So I became very curious as to why. What's the space of why does this conservation of the past, all this money and this prestige around things like World Heritage Sites, create these platforms of international cooperation? And I think Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and other, the key historic sites in your region will be key places of heritage diplomacy in the next couple of decades, because it's obviously becoming a center of so many geopolitical, geostrategic interests, and often culture and cultural cooperation. It forms part of that. It's talked about as soft power, but I don't think that captures the complexities of what's going on there. And I'll explain a bit about that, and I'm happy to talk about that more as well. So that also led me really to try and differentiate between cultural diplomacy and heritage diplomacy, which I won't go into now, but it speaks to that idea that it needs to be more than just about soft power. And in looking at a number of places, I was at a number of conferences about 5-6 years ago, UNESCO conferences, where it was very clear, and it was Turkish ambassadors, Japanese ambassadors, Indian ambassadors, talking about the value of the Silk Roads for intercultural dialogue and world heritage. And I was in these meetings thinking, what is happening here? And it was 6 months after the Belt and Road Initiative had been launched. So clearly they knew this idea of silk and silk histories had a lot of political and international currency. So that I literally woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning and went, there's that one belt, one road thing. And this is reviving the Silk Roads for the 21st century. There must be something here. And this is why I've ended up working on this topic for the last 5 years. And obviously I don't need to tell you there that this is the BRI is being framed as a revival of the Silk Roads for the 21st century, the maritime and the overland, and those two geographies of connectivity. So in the and I'd be interested to hear about your experiences of what you're reading in the different literatures you're reading. But in the Anglosphere and in the sort of Western academic analysis of Belt and Road, it's very much about infrastructure, geoeconomics, geopolitics, trade, special economic zones, and understanding BRI in those terms, which obviously makes sense, and it follows the big media stories of the international collaborations around special economic zones, pipelines, highways, container shipping ports, and so forth. And what a lot of organizations and journalists have been tracking are all the international meetings and structures of the architecture of diplomacy that China has put in place, including the AIIB, that enable this BRI to be advanced, and the multilateral organizations. And this is a slide from the US or Washington think tank that tracks these types of infrastructure projects. And I think it's a type of map you will be very, very familiar with. However, what's also been happening, and what I got interested in, is all this cultural sector projects that have also been taking place. And that has been framed with it by China as people-to-people connectivities. And obviously that gets talked about as soft power and just people-to-people. But because of my recent interests, as I say, in places like Cambodia, in Kashmir, in Sri Lanka, and Afghanistan, a sense that there's something more important, something much more important going on here. So I got interested in that. And the first thing to say is that from the United States, when they analyze the historical significance of Belt and Road and where China's foreign policy is going in the 21st century, they often talk about humiliation and China's desire to restore its place internationally because of this. And as you see in that slide, from an article, I think, 5 days ago, 6 or 7 days ago, an analysis of China that is about the modern history of humiliation by the West and nationalism that's being fueled, that is driving both domestic affairs and international. But I think what that misses is there's something else going on, which is covered by these types of articles and authors who are looking at the ways in which China is really investing heavily in quite an extraordinary way in terms of this rejuvenation of this cultural past and civilizational past. So what we're seeing in China is a connection between the modern political entity and geographical entity that is China, with this idea of a cynic civilizational space, to create this idea of a civilizational state that has a continuous history of 5,000 years. And that history is being kind of engineered into place, both at a kind of academic, scholarly level, but also within public culture. So this is one example which from the city of Xi'an, and where this public space, this is a public square that goes on for a kilometer or so, that has been built in 10 years, which is quite an extraordinary scale of cultural infrastructure. And you see at the far end of there a tower, which is a tower built by Xuanzang, and tells the story of the entry of Buddhism into China. And so this is not only about celebrating Tang Dynasty histories in China, where China was open to the world, but also the connections it has through to India, South Asia, down to Sri Lanka, and tells these connections of religion, trade, exchange, scientific exchange, and is very much using this idea of Northwest China as a gateway to a wider geography of into Central Asia and to West Asia and down to South Asia. And this is very much, I think, about communicating to the population of China, with these sort of cities being very popular domestic tourism locations, of saying that China is most confident when it's open and when it's looking out to the world. And this is the Silk Road narrative, that outward-looking exchange, the enrichment of trade from across borders is the ways in which a country succeeds and creates peace and harmony, both within a country and across borders. So I think this is very much a domestic public diplomacy exercise that China is advancing today. So that really brings us to the Silk Road narrative, and I guess many of you will recognise that map, the map from Ferdinand von Richthofen from his cartography of the 1870s, and his publication in 1877 back in Germany, and the coining of the term the Silk Road, as a way to explain trade and connection between Han Dynasty China and the Roman Empire. So he specifically talked about, using Chinese and European sources, the connections of the 2 centuries of the beginning of the Christian era. So it was a 300 to 400 year era that he was really kind of talking about, but in a very, very circumspect world. So because there was limited knowledge about pre-modern connectivities across Asia, he got a very, very small piece, a small glimpse of the complexities of a pre-modern regional history and connectivity, and therefore kind of offered this transcontinental line that was connecting northwest China with Germany. And that was in part because he was in the region to be mapping a transcontinental railway line that would supply coal from northwest China, which had been discovered in the mid-19th century, to an industrializing Europe that needed fossil fuels and energy sources to deal with industrial society and the fears of an impending war in the late 19th century. So that idea of a transcontinental route that connects right across is that shortest route between northwest China and Europe, and that's partly why we have this idea of a single Silk Road line that goes across the region. But it was not until the 1930s that the Silk Road really starts to enter the public imagination in Europe, as European explorers, including some of his students, start to travel from Europe to northwest China and other parts of Central Asia, and telling these stories of grand exploration through the great age of car travel. So what you see in this map is a tracking of the term Silk Road in English, and it would be interesting to look at this in different languages. It follows a similar pathways of how the term gains popularity in the 20th century. So you see there in the 1930s, as I say, it starts to enter public imagination, doesn't really have much currency through the Cold War, and only really comes to global fame at the end of the Cold War. And I think you would be very aware of, because of the opening up of your region for tourism at that time, and the ways in which the Silk Road becomes part of foreign policies, tourism, and a narrative of pre-modern globalization at a time when globalization was a new kind of movement that people were trying to understand after the end of the Cold War. But during the Cold War, the one country that really was interested in the Silk Road was Japan, because they used it as a mechanism, as a story of East Asian connectivities, peaceful connectivities between China and Japan during as a way to try and repair relations after the Second World War. So what you see there are slides that document the visit of Tanaka, the Japanese Prime Minister, to Peking in '72, and how that led to a Silk Road documentary, which you can see on YouTube, which is still regarded as the kind of the most authoritative Silk Road story or documentary series that was filmed in northwest China at that time. And the Olympic flame followed the Southern Silk Road, as it was called, in its path when it went to Athens to Tokyo in 1964. But at the end of the Cold War, UNESCO launched a Silk Road's Roads of Dialogue project, which ended up lasting 10 years. And this was very much about reducing suspicions of East and West at the end of the Cold War, and creating new forms of dialogue between countries and between religions and between religions and regions. So this extraordinary UN project produced many, many publications, conferences, museum exhibitions, scholarly works, and journalistic stories around the world. It also led to a number of expeditions that were called Silk Road expeditions that followed routes of Buddhism, routes of ceramics and and routes of trade through different regions. And it also included the maritime Silk Route. So this is the time when the maritime Silk Road starts to enter international sort of public policy and starts to gain some international visibility as a way to try and complement the idea of an overland Silk Road. So I'm sure many of you will be aware of how if you had books in the 1980s, the story was that the Silk Road declines once maritime trade starts in the 15th century or something. But now we have a different story, which is about a land-based and an overland Silk Road. So in that respect, the maritime Silk Road is only really sort of 30 years old in terms of its conceptual development. And what we also then see is that the Silk Road story over that 100 years or so has dramatically expanded from the idea that von Richthofen had in the late 1870s, where he was talking about Roman Empire, Han Dynasty trade, land-based trade, and now it includes the voyages of Zheng He, the Chinese admiral, in the 15th century, the travels of Marco Polo in the 13th century. So this Silk Road story has really expanded and proliferated in terms of its histories, its themes, and its geographies. And of course, whilst that maritime Silk Road began to gain attention after the events of 9/11, the focus turns back to Central Asia, and Central Asian countries were using Silk Road discourses for foreign policy after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and a number of organizations were promoting Silk Road strategic projects in the United States and cultural projects. So those two slides you see on the left and the right are from the Washington Mall, which is perhaps the most strategically significant public space in the world, where the Smithsonian Institute ran a Silk Road's Peaceful Relations exhibition that ran through the summer of 2002. And this was basically to promote to the US public and to members of Congress on their weekend trips to say that Central Asia and the Middle East is not just about radical Islamic fundamentalism. It's a region of long cultural connectivities and peaceful Islam and so on and so forth, to try and counter the response of the US government and the fear of what 9/11 was going to produce. And it also led to projects such as a dialogue among civilizations that was driven by Iran after 9/11, and also taken up by UNESCO because of Katsura Matsura, being the UNESCO Director General at that time, also had a strong understanding of the Silk Roads because of Japan's interest during the Cold War. So this idea of a dialogue among civilizations started to converge with the Silk Road history. So what we really see then, and this is one of the things I've really traced, is that the Silk Road in the 20th century comes to be associated with these terms and these ideas of peace and cooperation, dialogue among civilizations, the values of cosmopolitan. Sorry, I need some water. The values of cosmopolitanism, the productive use of East and West dialogue, and the peaceful relations between countries. In the 21st century, it's also become associated with, and this is what we're seeing now through other UN agencies, and most notably UNESCO, as in addition to those values that these intergovernmental bodies are looking to advance, today we're seeing the Silk Road being a platform for advancing other goals like the Sustainable Development Goals, youth education, gender equity. So if you go to UNESCO's website and look at their Silk Roads program, you'll see lots of these types of agendas that it's now piling in or adding into their Silk Roads platform of cooperation. So it's more than just a history. It's doing a lot of political work in the 21st century, and it did a lot of political work in the 20th century. So those two publications there, and I think by the sounds of it, you are somewhat familiar with them, are kind of trying to summarize some of that of what I've been talking about. And obviously, and I'll show you the slide of a book where I kind of also been talking about. So some of that history of the Silk Road in the modern era is sort of covered in that. And of course, what we're seeing today is China take forward this Silk Road within this architecture of Belt and Road. And you see in that text this idea of the civilizations being like water, that they can produce forms of cooperation. And so this is from a speech of Xi Jinping in Unesco 6 months after the launch of Belt and Road, entirely ignored by Western academics as trivial and as irrelevant. And these types of conferences that have been happening and events of dialogue among civilizations. Now, I think that's really something's fascinating going on there, which is about the rise of Asia being linked to the rise of the Silk Roads in the 21st century, the resuscitation of countries like Greece or Italy or Afghanistan that have been humiliated by Western powers in terms of the European Union or United States, or the Saudi world or the Arab world more broadly, that China is very using this idea of dialogue of civilizations to say that we should cooperate together in the 21st century to prosper and address the injustices of world history. So that's quite an interesting dimension. But what we're also seeing is this play out in terms of cultural sector cooperation. So it doesn't get the international coverage that the infrastructure projects get, because it doesn't require billions of dollars. But countries like Sri Lanka have willingly taken on maritime archaeology projects, and this is about demonstrating from the Chinese perspective that they were a maritime power on a par with the great maritime powers of European history. And so it links to that idea of a maritime Silk Road that puts China back into the center of world history. And so these projects are about finding Chinese shipwrecks off the Sri Lankan coast. And the Sri Lankan government kicked out American teams to allow these Chinese teams to come in. So I think this is really quite fascinating in terms of how this is rewriting world history, bringing the Indian Ocean in terms of pre-European encounters into the frame of world history. In a way that wouldn't happen if it was European countries that are providing the funding, such as Dutch or British or French, who constantly want to tell the story of European navigation through the Indian Ocean. And of course, what we're also seeing in those two circles is that the cultural aid converges with the other forms of geostrategic aid under Belt and Road. So those are two examples from Sri Lanka and Kenya, where a lot of Chinese money for cultural sector, for museums, for heritage, for archaeology, is going to the same locations as the other kind of Belt and Road cooperation. And they're just two examples, and there are many other than that. And I think we're seeing examples in your region of the same types of patterns. And that's interesting to think through. What does that mean? How do we think? And I think that's also therefore more than just about soft power, because these become much more entangled in bigger diplomatic relations and expectations and commitments. And what's driving that partly is the huge windfall that is Chinese tourism. 140 million or so Chinese tourists going out of China before COVID. And so in regions such as Turkey, this is very, very seductive and powerful. So this idea that the UN World Tourism Organization is promoting the idea of a Western Silk Road to complement the what they're calling the classical Silk Road, to bring Chinese tourists into that part of that end of the Eurasian continent and up into other parts of Europe. And that's also about how to rethink European history that connects to Asia. So with Chinese diplomats visiting countries like Greece and saying, you're not a European civilization, you're also Asiatic, and we should cooperate in the 21st century. So civilizational discourses that have interesting political resonances today. And so this is a slide from a meeting from Turkey, which has been hosting a number of the Black Sea Economic Cooperation Council meetings, and using history, heritage, and you see that in those maps in the background of how this was a region that was obviously fighting intensely over history, religion, culture just a generation ago, and now cooperating and finding their histories as a form of shared heritage that is also not only shared in their region, but also shared with China. And this is intensely driven by the desire to bring in the Chinese tourism industry. And what that presentation, that one there, is also about is also the inclusion of a number of Chinese think tanks to say to these countries, whether it's Bulgaria, Turkey, Romania, to say to them, you are invisible if you're not part of the Chinese ecosystem of the tourism industry. So stop using Google, stop using WhatsApp, be using the Chinese apps and the international payment systems such as Alipay to lure and to be enticing this tourism industry. So this was the story of the United States in the second half of the 20th century, using Visa, American Express, and MasterCard, and obviously the SWIFT international payment systems. And again, I would say that Chinese tourism is far more than just soft power. This entangles these countries in ways that will have deep consequences in the next 20 to 30 years. And so this whole cultural signposting of how these countries are entangled and why you should be attracting Chinese tourists on this basis is part of that kind of network building in as part of the kind of Belt and Road, Silk Road connection. But then that also brings us to some other fascinating developments of how history, culture, heritage are being used towards AI, artificial intelligence technologies. So there are a number of organizations, and I'm now writing about this, and hopefully I'll have a paper comes out soon, on amazing developments that are happening in China and the investments that are happening in this space around digital heritage, digital culture initiatives. And so to give you one example to connect to what I've been just talking about, this is a artificial intelligence program that is an agency that's promoting well-being and tourism satisfaction in Armenia. But you notice from the bottom of that slide, it's what the subtext is. It's sponsored by UNDP and the Russian government. So why is big data being collected about these types of economic connections? Again, I think there's something else going on there that academia is not really tracking as much as it should be or might do. And it's more than just about soft power. And obviously states around the region are intensely interested in these forms of big data for all sorts of reasons. And I think that's where the health Silk Road is consequential in the 21st century as well, where we're going forward in the 21st century. So then you pull back in scale and look at all those individual developments within a much, much bigger geography. And so these are the developmental corridors of Belt and Road as you see them on maps. These then are the Silk Road World Heritage listings, which are the blue dots are those places that have already been listed as Silk Road World Heritage. And these other dots, red and green, are the places that the UNESCO and other organizations are encouraging countries to add on to World Heritage listings as international cooperation and collaboration. And I was in Almaty as part of exactly one of those meetings to build further international collaborations. This, again, goes back to what I was saying about UNESCO and the UN agencies' investments in this. This is all about international dialogue, intercultural dialogue. So this is a powerful language for them that is being brought within this Belt and Road architecture. And there you see the kind of the geographical overlay, which I think has massive consequences for infrastructure development, hotel zones, ports, airports, regional development, land, community displacements because of the increasing real estate associated with tourism industries. So in cities like Samarkand, there's talk of building a new city next door to it. There's a major infrastructure railway hub where these railway lines that have primarily so far been about the trafficking of goods will be also about the movement of peoples in the coming years. So I think, this is part of that bigger geography of connectivity. And the final bit I would just talk about is just to say, therefore, we're seeing a whole new, particularly in your region, a whole new way of talking about history, culture, regional connectivities, which is a Silk Road history that you are very, very familiar with, but now becomes part of an international framework of cooperation. And a lot of countries, as we were just talking about before I started, the focus of interest from a number of countries. So to just give you some idea of why that's important, I take you back to Palestine in 1912 or 1911, I think, or around that time, where archaeology was part of the British Empire's mapping and cartography and surveillance and strategic interests in kind of diminishing Ottoman power. So the rivalries between France and Britain in that period, archaeology has always been folded into the kind of technologies of empire and technologies of governance by imperial powers in the European experience. And so, so the mapping and the rewriting of space around certain ideas and histories and geographies and how that relates to the construction of national borders, national boundaries, archaeology and other fields and anthropology are not politically neutral in that process. So if we come back to what's happening today, where does that take us today? Well, it's more than just about photographs and about maps on paper. We now have a digital infrastructure that is doing this type of mapping. And what does that mean for communities living across regions where, for example, Silk Road corridors are being talked as Buddhist routes, but what happens if there's Muslim villages living along those routes? What does that mean? The story of World Heritage in the 20th century is about the forceful relocation of peoples from World Heritage areas. And are we going to see a lot more of that in the future? What does it mean about border disputes between India and China? Border disputes in your region about claimings of history, claimings of significance. So it's and so we're seeing technologies that are very, very powerful that then erase all those complexities on the ground. They just create this new kind of cartography that grossly simplifies the complexities of really what is a lived experience for urban residents and rural communities alike. And where is that going in the future? And obviously, what it means is that only certain countries have this kind of digital power. The smaller countries in the region do not have this capacity to write and control these histories. So when I said I started off working on Cambodia, it was the French, the Japanese that claimed they had the authority of knowledge to be implementing new governance structures for managing these types of locations. And I think that's what we're going to see in the coming years through these types of new technologies that are then feed into, so all these types of maps feed into planning models and zoning regulations and so on and so forth. So they have a political biography to them that is not just merely about an academic process or a scholarly process. They take on a life of their own that through this Silk Road thing, and then it gets linked to development programs. And these are being taken by satellites. So this is kind of, as well as other kind of LiDAR technologies. So this is happening at a scale that we've never seen before. And it's being driven by some powerful players. So I will leave it there. There's many things more to talk about, but hopefully that gives you a taste of what kind of the interests I'm working on. And that's the book that kind of begins to capture some of these issues, which came out last year.
Thank you so much, Tim. It was a very illuminating talk. I guess your presentation encapsulated all the literature around cultural diplomacy through different disciplines in a 30-minute talk. Wonderful, I should say. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Probably there are a lot of questions coming to our colleagues' minds. To start with, I am wondering actually, what kind of heritages are we talking about?
That's a great question.
Tangible, intangible heritage, and the buildings, or for example, are there any studies towards classification of intangible heritage, like songs, for example, to differentiate or to isolate the Chinese elements, for example, in a Turkish song whatsoever? Yeah. You know, one question is that, and another question is, maybe can we talk about this migration of Silk Road from east to west? Some of the themes you were talking about is the inclusion of the western part of the Silk Road, more or less, into the broader Silk Road understanding or discussions. So, for example, when you show these heritage maps, most of the cases are located in the eastern side of the Silk Road. If we put a line, for example, from Russia to Turkey, then most of the heritage or most of the cases are situated in the eastern part, sorry. And the last question, I am wondering if there are any cases, you have answered actually more or less, any cases that some countries use or in quote unquote abuse as a policy instrument of this heritage or cultural diplomacy as an instrument for their foreign policy. I mean, which I mean generally China, to increase its geopolitical sphere of influence. Or are there any countries other than China as well? I mean, I don't know. Yeah.
So no, they're three great questions, and they're among the many topics, obviously, that I wasn't able to cover. But that first one of what is heritage, I think that's a great question. I can answer that in the sense of how I think that's really evolving. So if you go back to this idea of a kind of golden age of Silk Road research, which was the collection of items from Central Asia and Northwest China today, that they're now in museums in St. Petersburg and Berlin and London and Japan and Korea and the United States. Those were things that were carried. So it was manuscripts, ceramics, objects, frescoes, Buddhist paintings that were ripped off walls and then carried by horse and camel, so that was this kind of original heritage of the Silk Roads. You can tell that story of connectivity through that. And then I think really once the Soviet Union kind of moves out of the scene, then the cities of Central Asia start to become branded as Silk Road destinations. So you start to get the archaeological, the built heritage. And that's both an internal process, but also from the Western imaginary, where I've got some, in my office, I've got some interesting tour books, which sort of talk about the same book, and it gets published 4 times in a decade. And in the third version, it becomes a Silk Road city, cities of the Silk Road. And so that idea that in that puppet, so that connects with that graph I said about how it reaches global fame in the 1990s. It's so that's in the material culture, the built environment, archaeological sites become part of that. And then you're correct of saying now I think what we're seeing now is intangible, and that's a very new thing. And that's so it's music, and there's been talk of the Silk Roads. There was obviously Yo-Yo Ma Silk Roads Ensemble, but it doesn't reach international cultural policy by organizations such as UNESCO. Whereas now that is starting to happen in a quite distinct way. And I think, so the Silk Roads is really powerful in terms of the UN world, UNESCO, because it crosses over pretty much all of their programs. World heritage, memory of the world, intangible heritage, underwater heritage, cultural roots, cultural landscapes. So you can see how governments will go, well, we've got documents here, we'll put that on the memory of the world. We've got shipwrecks, we'll put that on underwater. We'll cultural roots that we can connect. So yeah, there's a lot of, so Indonesia is pushing spice histories now as their story of the maritime Silk Road. The Chinese maritime Silk Road language is very much focused around ceramics as material culture, but it's also then now talking about histories of navigation and the transfer of knowledge as a kind of science exchange and science knowledge transfer along the Silk Road historically. So you have Persian navigation, you have and languages that are being that were transmitted along these different routes. So it's in that respect, I think it's a very, very proliferating, and it's music, dance, food, obviously gastronomy, and UNESCO now has 18 themes for its Silk Roads program, and it speaks to that expansion of that. So I would say you're going to see that expand and expand, and that then becomes what is a Silk Road costume or what is a Silk Road dress? We know there's national dresses and we know they're invented traditions. What's this geocultural form that is a Silk Road food? I mean, where does that come from? And it's like, so this is going to be an interesting space of creative, and then trying to anchor it to kind of certain locations and certain moments in history, which is going to be a political process as much as a kind of academic process. And then you say, how are others? No, you said about moving to the West. Yes, I think Italy, Greece, they're picking up on this. I've got colleagues, really interesting work on. Oh, I'll give a good example. Greek universities are rewriting Greek history to be part of the Silk Roads and understand how they're part of the Silk, how they've been connected to China, to be buying into this Chinese tourism market. I mean, that's quite extraordinary. It's just like Greece is no longer just the center of European civilization. It's part of a wider geography that connects it right across. And that's really, and so what all this does is put China back at the center of world history. And it's restoring its natural order. Now, that's why I think the Silk Road's narrative is doing a lot of work domestically and internationally. And Italy and countries like Croatia that are using ways to think about how to reframe Mediterranean histories as outward-looking, a geophilosophical region, as people are now writing about, that has been connected to other regions through trade, history, and other forms and technology. So yeah, I think that picking up in the Mediterranean is particularly important, and the Black Sea region. And then you said other countries' foreign policy. Yeah, I think, of course, what this is also producing is counter narratives, counter sort of foreign policy frameworks. And somewhere like India is the most obvious example, which came up with Project Morsam, as an alternative to Belt and Road, which is a geostrategic block of 22 countries, based on the notion of a monsoon winds history, and that being the Arabic word for monsoon, as I understand it, and saying that India is this kind of center of this civilizational zone. We've always been connected through to our regional neighbors. These are our friends. And so what this language of historical connectivity says, that we were friends in the 13th century, we should be friends in the 21st century. So it's quite a enticing language. And so countries like Sri Lanka are maneuvering between these big powers, and they're very adept as countries like Kazakhstan are of maneuvering between big players, right? And then of course Russia is very nervous as well about this Silk Road, Belt and Road language, and how that moves a center of a kind of Eurasian geographical cultural history towards the east, and takes it from a kind of Slavic kind of, or Eurasianism that we know has kind of been fundamental to Russian foreign policy for over different periods in the 20th century.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And the last answer you have given reminded me a theoretical discussion about this subject, about this Silk Road. Some even argue that Silk Road is just a myth of modern academic world, while the Indian Ocean-based spice trade was the main conveyor of civilization from east to west, and vice versa. And the exchange have occurred throughout this maritime roads. Would you agree? I mean, even in the Roman Empire times, they say, I mean, through the utilization of Arab navigators and tradesmen, etc., in the Middle East, into the Europe. So is that some kind of value in this argument? Are there any?
Yeah, I've struggled, I've lost many nights for 3 years trying to work out what is the Silk Road. How do you explain this? What is the Silk Road? And the way I came to think about it, and the way I'm trying to write about it, is to say it's a geocultural imaginary. So it's its way of imagining the world, and pre-modern globalization. So pre-modern connectivity. So von Richthofen, as I mentioned in my talk, that had a very, very small glimpse of that, had a tiny kind of example of that, of a much, much bigger story. And it was after World War II, the Japanese scholars, under a UN program, said that von Richthofen only talked about east-west connections. He missed all the north-south. He missed the connections down into North Korea, South Korea, or the Korean Peninsula, Mongol histories of connection, Siberian connectivities that stretch back centuries. And so we need to expand. So this was in 1957, and we need to expand this geography of the Silk Road history. And so that's why at the end of the Cold War, it has these multiple routes. And I didn't have time to go into it, but so this geography expands. So we are getting a more and more comprehensive understanding, and a lot of research still needs to be done. But it gets captured by this one term. And what it also does, particularly in the West, is kind of exoticize this complexities of Eurasian history. So it's not really a story of empires or famines or plagues or wars. It's a kind of open, free flow of culture and knowledge and scientific transfer. But we know history is much more complicated than that. That's if we wrote about the history of the internet today, it would be simplistic to talk about it's just the open, free flow of ideas and knowledge. It would be, we know it's much more complicated than that. So I think we will see over time a more kind of nuanced picture of these complexities, but obviously there's limited evidence, and there's but it's been a very so I think that where I said it enters popular culture in Europe is really important, because then it becomes a kind of fantasy of, so National Geographic was describing great explorers retracing the footsteps of Marco Polo, and it becomes this. Hollywood makes films about Marco Polo in the 1930s. This great explorer conquering Asian women, conquering Asian landscapes, negotiating with Genghis Khan, and blah. So it becomes this fantasy of Asia in the Western imaginary, and kind of so it's both a scholarly, popular culture and diplomatic language. So it's really confusing how it's evolved and continue. And interestingly, just final example. There was a French archaeologist who discovered Chinese silk in Syria in 1932, and all of his European colleagues said, no, you're wrong, it can't be. It's impossible. Syria is purely part of Western civilization and linked to European and Roman antiquity. And he was very angry, and he published all these articles saying, in this book saying, none of my colleagues believe me. And now if you go to Wikipedia, it says that, these Aleppo and Baghdad are all Silk Road cities. So at that time, it had no credibility. So the geography of it has expanded over the decades. So where it starts off in Central Asia, now it's this kind of, and Belt and Road just continues to. But what's also, sorry, I'm waffling, but what's also interesting then is who are the authors that get to write this history? So now China is driving it. So it tells the story the way it wants.
So it is, from one aspect, it is something against the Eurocentric view of
Absolutely.
history, view of civilization.
Which is why it's really important. It puts Central Asia into world history.
Yeah.
And it puts the Indian Ocean into world history in a way that European academics have completely overlooked and completely ignored. Mm. The Indian Ocean doesn't enter world history until the Europeans enter it in the 1500. Mm. So this brings into focus pre-European histories. It brings into focus the civilizational importance of your region, Sogdian histories that get ignored within kind of European narratives of world history. The danger is it becomes a story of Europe and Asia that crosses over Central Asia, and that's the big risk, I think. So that's also important for.
So you would expect some kind of a great game in the upcoming decades. In this,
well, exactly. Well, I mean, that's a great question, right? And I think a great cultural game, a great historical game, for sure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. A brilliant answer, I should say. Very, very intriguing issues and very interlinked. I mean, so many economic, geopolitics, cultural, power, and actually there were some pioneers in European thinking of Asia as part of the world history, like Edward Gibbons from the UK, and there was a Swedish geographer also,
Sven Hedin.
Yeah, they were important, but probably they were lost in the bulk of Eurocentric understanding of the world. Yeah.
And I think they gain currency now.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think so Sven Hedin's book was one of the ways in which it popularized in the European imagination. So he was von Richthofen's student, but a much better writer. So he published a book in 1936 in Sweden called The Silk Road, in English in 1938, and that was part of. But interestingly, he got associated with Nazi Germany and lost his credibility in Europe at exactly the same time.
That's right. That's right. He was awarded with some German
That's right. Yeah.
awards, I think. Yeah.
And he was interesting. He was sponsored by Lufthansa for potential air routes across to China.
Wow.
So that's why he was funded for those explorations in the 1930s.
Oh, very interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Very little known, actually.
Yeah.
So, dear friends, do we have questions?
Yes. Yeah. Professor Winter, thank you for a very interesting presentation, and we also follow your readings. I have a little bit maybe modern reflection question about the Silk Road policy. You mentioned about this anti-Silk Road narrative as well, and you mentioned big countries like India, Russia, maybe the West, or maybe Japan and further. But we also know, living in Central Asia, living in Kazakhstan, that the narrative, and especially the perception of it, is not very easy. It's not very optimistic, especially for countries, for small countries, since of the BRI and the dominance of China. We had an idea that we've been part of the Silk Road. It was part of us. We were the maintainers, we were the transporters. But over time, all the things you mentioned, including the interpretation of history, technology, trade routes, and so on, there is, of course, to say it mildly, there are some people, or at least some groups, who feel very uneasy with that, and especially with what's happening in Eastern Turkestan or Xinjiang. So what you would say about this aspect of that because, for example, countries like Kyrgyzstan, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, specifically, or Tajikistan, specifically countries which have borders with China, and we had in recent Chinese publications, new maps, maps with territorial claims. And also we had, for example, manifestations against even infrastructure investments and projects. So talking about the perspective of small countries, or for example, the countries which might think that the new, maybe Sinocentric interpretation would damage them in different ways, including culturally. Some people are talking about, for example, the loss of, or the destruction of the Muslim heritage along the road. So what you would say about that? Not very pessimistic perception of it.
No, I fully concur with you. I mean, if I give a talk, I sort of try to remain neutral, because I don't know how this is being read, but there's hopefully what I try to say is that this has big consequences, and if you're kind of aware of, if you give if this is in the context of Indonesia, there's issues there that are different to Sri Lanka, but the big themes are exactly the same. That this is quite a whole new form of sort of strategic use of history, of culture, for reconstructing space, reimagining space around, and rethinking borders, using digital technologies to do that, using the international systems such as the UN to do that, to legitimize. And it's all wrapped up in this, what seems to be a very benign language of the Silk Roads. And it's very seductive for authors like Peter Frankopan from Oxford University, right, who is advancing this, or the National Geographic. And this has very real consequences for countries like you. I fully agree. And it's, I mean, my book here, which I'm reading now, the link between civilizational discourses and empire in the 19th century, is to say, are we seeing the same things play out today? Is really China doing the same things today? That and the question is, I think then, is it China has the opportunities to avoid those 19th century mistakes by European powers, but that's yet to be seen. So I think there's good reason to be anxious nervous about how these great powers are maneuvering. And it's not just China; it's India and others. And for the smaller countries, whether it's Nepal or Bhutan or countries in your region, I think this is a challenging future and unleashes a whole new sort of cultural politics that we haven't seen on this scale before. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I think so. I think there's good reasons to be optimistic in terms of how. Think about how we need to reopen borders with COVID, and how international dialogue's required for that, and how the Silk Roads can be a productive platform for that. So it's a complicated future to say, how do we use this in productive ways, and how do we steer this without one or two countries shaping it to their own, and that diplomacy always being a kind of space where you've got national and internationalist interests playing out simultaneously, and they're always entangled in each other, and therefore you can never disentangle them. It's just understanding that complexity, I think, is a challenge, and this Silk Roads is an extraordinary example of that. But I think what I liked about your comment was how it's kind of almost been taken away from you. This is a kind of language that you felt like there was some ownership, maybe too strong, but certainly a sense of cultural. I'm not sure what the words are, but attachment to that maybe being kind of taken away from you. And
I would say that even in modern sense, in political economic sense, you mentioned about the infrastructure projects. We're mainly focusing on infrastructure projects. That's partially because, of course, our economic contribution, industrial, technological contribution is low. So I don't know, our government rightfully thinks that this is an opportunity to benefit as a transit route.
Yes.
So, of course, we don't have any claims that we would be part of that, even from the economic or the new Silk Road in some way. But that's the idea is that, of course, for same with also we could say about Mongolia or Kyrgyzstan as well. There are at least some questions of people how we should maybe structure it in a way that we would play maybe more beneficial for us role. And for example, starting with environmental and other things.
Right.
So even this technological advancements, for example, artificial intelligence, here there have been interpretations whether this would be the breach of security, surveillance, other things. These are the questions which also raised. Should we trust this?
Yeah, and that's what I had in mind when I talked about tourism, because I think that's a vehicle by which these things enter new territories, right? These digital technologies can enter new spaces.
Yeah. So, and especially this is, I think, for countries which have borders with China. Of course, we talk about the smaller powers. They are more alerted than countries who don't have border. Like Uzbekistan, right. They also have non-visa regime prior to pandemic. They're a little bit easy because they don't share border. While
interesting,
for example, Kyrgyzstan, Mongolia, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, we share borders. So.
Yeah. And I think there's the same playing out in the Himalayan region.
Yes.
Yeah, interesting.
So I think there's a more or less widespread xenophobia also attached to this all discussions around the Silk Road and the fear of hegemony.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
In terms of economics, but also cultural as well.
Yeah.
So, on the one hand, it is seen as a more global or more liberal view of multicultural coexistence, but also on the other hand, it may be seen as a new, like Americanized globalization, this time of China-led globalization.
Right, indeed, yeah.
Kind of fears.
I think you're right, and I think at the moment, I mean, you're living with this obviously more than we are in Australia, but by looking across a number of regions, that the questions remain to see how this is going to play out. How is China going to use these new forms of influence and power? And I think that's the big question, right? But I think the also interesting thing is for you, which I kind of thought about today, is how, because of this expansion of the Silk Road, you're now brought into a much bigger geography. kind of it goes all across the Indian Ocean, right? In terms of these regional architectures, the Silk Road strategies of the 1990s that were led by Japan, United States, Korea, and obviously governments in your region were about, you know, those potential pipeline routes to get energy into East Asia. But now this is a whole bigger geography that goes from the Mediterranean down to Southeast Asia. So, and then you get brought into kind of cultural policy frameworks. So the whole complexity of the players that are now involved in the region is, I think, which may materialize in on the ground projects and funding is quite fascinating.
Maybe if it gets bigger and broader, it will be less easier for China to to exert a greater influence. For example, for the latest, this RCEP project, this comprehensive economic partnership for the Asia Pacific, which Australia is part of. Many people also say that China cannot easily champion or be the biggest player in a setting where Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea are members of.
And I think small countries are very adept at trying to balance powers, right? So bringing in other players, to create that kind of balance of influence, and to not kind of be drawn in and be too dependent in whether it's economically or whatever. And I saw that very, very clearly in Cambodia, where they became very, very adept in a post-war situation of bringing in both European, North American, but also Asian countries and playing one off against each other.
Yeah, I see generally them as lubricants between big powers, which are
each other. Yeah. It's the small countries that are the most fascinating, right? You can see the complexity of what's going on. It's not so interesting to look at the big countries. It's the small ones that really open up the fascinating complexity.
Leveling the ground, more or less, maybe. Any further difference? Any further comments, questions? Or everything is clear? I think more than clear, probably. And we have, I think, a great deal of food for thought, for further research, for further discussions. And I should also say that we are more than open collaborations of any kind. If you are interested in getting some kind of consultancy or some kind of work from our institute, we are more than happy to do that.
Yeah, well, I mean, we discussed over email the idea of an MOU, and I've advanced that. That's with kind of administration sections in the university, and it's got slowed up because of end of year, and that's definitely something I'll pick up. But then, and hopefully, I mean, I certainly will hope to travel to the region, and then we can. As soon as borders reopen, I was meant to be there this year. I was actually meant to be in Central Asia for a couple of months of field work. So hopefully that will happen in the next year. Or two.
It will be great. It will be great.
So, and then see where that goes, right? I mean, hopefully those themes connect to what you're doing. I know they're somewhat different, but as you mentioned, they sort of hopefully cross-cut different sectors. So hopefully it'll be a platform for a longer conversation.
Exactly. Thank you so much. It's a highly relevant subject in these days. For most of
and complicated, right?
Very, very much. Yeah, that's right. That's right. And we are also publishing books, by the way. If you have any idea of, we are publishing. So we act as a publisher house, and we have.
You normally publish in which languages? Russian or English?
Russian, English as well. Yeah, we have recently published Professor Nurlan Genci Ahmet's work on the Chinese relations with the Central Asian powers in historical times in the around Ming Dynasty, and he is now at Harvard University. He was previously at the Bonn University, and he also worked for us for 6 months as a visiting fellow. So we are always open for those kinds of projects.
Yeah, and it sounds like it'd be a great place for me to come and spend some time as a visiting person and do that at some point in the next couple of years. So that sounds like a great.
And also reports. I mean, shorter than a book, as well. And also we have a scientific journal called the Eurasian Research Journal. We also publish biannually, English. It's an English journal, refereed. So, and also we support some projects as well, scientific projects. We have some grants for that. So we are all open for those.
That sounds excellent. That sounds very good. Yeah, that sounds ideal. And you are the center of world affairs at the moment. So if I have, it's like you're in a complicated space. So.
That's right. That's right. We are just at the crossroads of India, Russia, China, even Europe as well. So, Professor Winter, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a very
thanks for the invitation.
Enjoyable talk to listen to you, and we will be keeping in touch, and we want to collaborate with you more, and
maintain the dialogue. That sounds good. And
exactly.
Yeah, it's certainly maintain dialogue on email, and then I'll send you a couple more things that hopefully coming out might be of interest.
Perfect.
Then,
yeah,
we'll see what we can do next year. And once borders reopen, that'll be a lot easier.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. So, okay, thanks
have a good break. And
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Merry Christmas in advance.
And you.
Bye-bye.
See you soon. Thanks.
Bye-bye.